Welcome to grim fiction, where darkness meets tranquility. Here, we weave haunting tales set to the soothing sound of rain, perfect for those who crave a touch of the eerie to drift off to sleep. Every night, immerse yourself in new stories that blend the mysterious with the calming, transforming your nights into a journey through the shadows. Subscribe now and let the rain carry you into a world of chilling tales posted daily just for you. The key was small, heavy, and cold in Lila's palm. She had expected the house to look charmingly rustic, something she could fix up in a few weekends. But the moment she saw it, a crumbling two-story structure, its once white paint blistered and flaking, she knew it would take more than a few weekends. The house seemed to breathe sorrow, its sagging roof and shattered windows giving it a hunched, almost human posture. Yet she had no choice. This was her inheritance, her fresh start. Her boots crunched on the gravel driveway as she approached the door. The air was thick and humid, carrying the faint scent of rotting wood. She paused at the threshold, staring up at the towering front door. It felt like the house was staring back. Inside, the air was heavier, stale with age and neglect. The floorboards groaned under her weight, their complaints reverberating through the empty halls. The layout was simple enough: kitchen to the left, a large sitting room to the right, and a narrow staircase at the back. Cobwebs draped over the banister, and dust blanketed every surface. She wrinkled her nose and pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The dim, muted light filtering through the broken windows made everything look gray and lifeless. As she moved through the house, a peculiar sense of unease took hold. It wasn't just the state of disrepair or the eerie silence. It was a feeling she couldn't quite name, like the air itself was watching her, like the walls remembered more than they should. She shook off the thought and forced herself to focus on the practical, clearing out the debris, patching the broken windows, getting the place livable. But in the back of her mind, something gnawed at her, a vague, persistent thought that perhaps the house had been abandoned for good reason. Lila's first night was restless. Every creak, every distant gust of wind, every groan of the old wood made her heart race. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the shadows of tree branches playing tricks on her mind. It was just an old house, she told herself over and over, just an old house. But when she closed her eyes, she thought she heard faint footsteps, slowly pacing in the hallway outside her bedroom door. Morning light seeped through the cracked window panes, illuminating the dust motes that hung heavy in the air. Lila stretched, stiff from a night of restless tossing, and resolved to make the most of her day. The house wouldn't fix itself. She grabbed her work gloves, a sturdy broom, and a bucket of cleaning supplies, and set to work clearing out the years of neglect. It wasn't long before she reached the upstairs hallway. The wooden planks creaked beneath her boots as she moved from room to room, sweeping debris and opening windows to let in fresh air. As she made her way to the end of the hallway, she came upon a door that stopped her short. Unlike the others, this one was not only closed, it was locked. Thick, rusted metal bars crisscrossed over its surface, and a heavy padlock hung from an equally corroded latch. The wood itself was darker than the rest, deeply scored with scratches and odd carvings that looked deliberate but foreign. Lila leaned closer, brushing a layer of dust off with her glove. The carvings were faintly geometric, almost runic, though she didn't recognize the symbols. What really struck her was how cold the air felt near the door. The hallway was warm and musty, yet as soon as she stood in front of this door, the temperature seemed to drop. It was as though she had stepped into the shadow of a cloud. Frowning, she reached for the handle, but it didn't budge. She tried peering into the thin crack between the door and the frame, but there was nothing but darkness on the other side. "Okay," she muttered, her voice loud in the otherwise silent house. "Where's the key?" She searched every drawer, every corner of the upstairs, scouring closets and rummaging through forgotten trunks in the attic. The key was nowhere to be found. She even went downstairs to the kitchen and the sitting room, overturning dusty cushions and old coffee tins. Nothing. Frustration prickled at her. The locked door felt like a riddle left behind by whoever had lived here before, a challenge to be solved. But without the key, she was at a standstill. As the sun began to set, Lila found herself back in front of the door. The house had grown quieter, the usual groans and creaks subsiding as though the place itself was holding its breath. She leaned in, pressing her ear against the wood. The surface felt colder than ever, almost icy. For a long moment she stood there, straining to hear something. And then she did. It was faint at first, so faint she thought it might be her imagination, a soft, sibilant whisper. The sound seemed to rise and fall, just below the threshold of understanding. She pulled back, her pulse quickening, but as soon as she moved away, the sound vanished. "No," she said aloud, shaking her head as if to dismiss the entire experience. "It's nothing, just an old house making old house noises." Yet as she walked back downstairs, leaving the locked door behind, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was on the other side of that door had been waiting for her, and now it knew she was there. After days of clearing out debris and scrubbing years' worth of grime from every surface, Lila began to settle into the house. She still hadn't figured out how to open the locked door upstairs, and she tried not to dwell on it. If she thought too much about those faint whispers, or how cold the air felt around that door, her imagination started to run wild. Instead, she focused on the house's exterior, thinking it might help to clean up the yard and take a look at the property line. The woods surrounding the house were dense and seemed to stretch on forever. On her first day outside, Lila took note of the tall pines and the way their branches swayed gently in the breeze. A dilapidated old fence marked the edge of the yard, but beyond that was an overgrown path, barely visible under years of fallen leaves and creeping moss. Something about the path called to her, and without much thought, she grabbed her boots and headed into the trees. The sunlight filtered down in slanting beams, and for a while the woods seemed peaceful. Birds chirped above, and the forest floor crackled pleasantly underfoot. Lila followed the trail, curious where it might lead. But after a short distance, the air shifted. The trees began to grow closer together, their gnarled branches twisting into unnatural shapes. The deeper she went, the quieter it became, as though the forest was slowly swallowing sound. No more birds, no more wind, just her footsteps, and then she saw it, a shadow darting between the trees up ahead. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't a deer or any kind of animal she recognized. It moved upright, quick and smooth, vanishing behind the trunks before she could get a proper look. Lila stood there, squinting into the gloom, but saw no sign of movement. She waited another moment before shaking her head and continuing on. It was probably just her mind playing tricks. After all, it was an old forest. Shadows could look like anything if you stared at them long enough. By the time she reached the end of the trail, she found herself standing in a small, eerily perfect clearing. In the center was a large stone, flat on top like a makeshift altar. The edges of the clearing felt wrong-like. The trees were leaning in too much, as though they wanted to close off the space entirely. Lila felt a wave of unease. The stone was covered in strange carvings, similar to the ones she had seen on the locked door upstairs. She ran her fingers over the markings, and a chill ran up her spine. It wasn't just the cold of the stone, it was something deeper, a feeling of being watched. She didn't stay long in the clearing. By the time she returned to the house, the sun was setting, and the woods felt darker than before. Shadows seemed to flicker just beyond her vision, shapes moving behind the trees where the light couldn't reach. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard it again, the low, rhythmic tapping sound. It came from the woods this time, distant but steady, as if someone or something was marking time in the darkness. It was only her second night listening to the woods, but she already hated the sound. Even when she tried to convince herself it was just an old branch knocking in the breeze, a nagging feeling in her gut told her otherwise. The attic was the last place Lila wanted to clean, but she knew she had to face it eventually. After days of working on the main floors, she finally mustered the courage to climb the narrow stairs. The door to the attic groaned as she opened it, and a dry, musty smell wafted out. Sunlight streamed in through a tiny, filthy window, revealing stacks of boxes, forgotten furniture, and a thick carpet of dust. Lila spent hours sorting through old trunks and broken furniture. Most of the items were unremarkable, faded photographs, mildewed books, moth-eaten curtains. But near the far wall, she found something that stopped her in her tracks. An old wooden chest with a rusted lock that had long since broken. Inside, she discovered an assortment of trinkets, a few loose photographs, and a leather-bound diary. The cover was cracked and faded, its corners worn smooth by years of handling. The spine creaked as she opened it, and a small cloud of dust rose into the air. The handwriting inside was uneven and jagged, as though the writer had been in a rush or under duress. The first few entries were ordinary enough, chronicling the mundane life of a man who had once lived here. He wrote about repairing the roof, tending to a small garden, and dealing with the biting cold of winter. But as Lila flipped through the pages, the tone changed. The entries became more fragmented, the writing more frantic. I heard it again last night. I know it's not the wind. The shadows are closer now. I can feel them watching me. The door at the end of the hall, it wasn't locked before. The man's words sent a chill down her spine. He described sleepless nights filled with whispers, the sensation of cold fingers brushing against his neck, and the growing certainty that something had taken residence in the house. The locked door upstairs featured prominently in his later entries. He wrote of seeing it move ever so slightly, as though something on the other side were testing it. He mentioned finding the strange carvings on its surface and hearing faint, inhuman voices calling his name. By the time Lila reached the final pages, the writing was barely legible. The ink was smeared, the sentences scrawled at odd angles. It's coming from the woods now. They're here, just beyond the tree line. I can't sleep, I can't eat, I can't leave. If anyone finds this, know that I tried. I tried to keep it locked away. The last entry was just 2 words, repeated over and over in a shaky hand. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Lila stared at the diary for a long time, her hands trembling. She felt as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for her to understand the gravity of what she had just read. She closed the book and tucked it under her arm, her mind racing. She couldn't ignore it anymore. The locked door, the carvings, the shapes in the woods. It was all connected. But what exactly was she dealing with? And more importantly, what was she going to do about it? As she descended the attic stairs, the diary clutched tightly in her hands. Lila knew one thing for certain. The man who wrote those words had faced something terrible, and it might still be waiting in the house. The morning after discovering the diary, Lila couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that hung over her. The words scrawled in those final entries replayed in her mind, whispering like a soft, relentless echo. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. She felt a gnawing need for answers, so she decided to venture into the nearest village. The drive into town was short, but the change in atmosphere was stark. The village was quaint and picturesque, nestled in a valley surrounded by hills. Brightly painted storefronts lined the cobbled main street, and flower boxes overflowed with blooms. It was a far cry from the brooding shadows of her new home. But as Lila stepped out of her car, she noticed the villagers seemed to give her a wide berth. She caught sidelong glances, heard quiet murmurs as she passed. It was as if they knew who she was, or rather, where she'd come from. Lila pushed her way into a small cafe, determined to find someone who could help her piece together the house's past. She approached the counter, where an elderly woman with piercing gray eyes and thin, wispy hair was wiping down a mug. Lila offered a hesitant smile. "Excuse me," she began. "I just moved into the old house up the hill and The woman froze, the mug still clutched in her hand. She slowly set it down, her eyes narrowing. "That house," she said, her voice low. "You're staying there?" "Yes," Lila replied, a nervous flutter in her chest. "I was hoping you could tell me more about it. Did something happen there?" The cafe grew uncomfortably quiet. Even the few other patrons seemed to be listening, their conversations dying mid-sentence. The woman leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You shouldn't have gone there, girl. That place isn't right. Never has been." Lila's stomach tightened. "What do you mean? What happened?" The woman glanced around, as if afraid of being overheard. "People go in, but they don't always come out. They lose themselves. Sometimes they stay there, and they change. It started with the woods. Something moved in those woods long ago. When the house was built, it was already cursed ground. Everyone in town knows that. The man before you." She trailed off, her expression grim. "He thought he could keep it contained, but he was wrong. He's still in there, you know." "What do you mean, still in there?" Lila pressed. The woman shook her head. "Not alive, not anymore, but he never truly left. And he's not alone. The others, the shadows, they're always there waiting." Lila felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. She thought of the locked door, the carvings, the shapes moving in the woods at dusk. "What can I do?" she whispered. "How do I make it stop?" The woman looked at her with pity, then shook her head. "If I were you, I'd leave. Don't try to fight it. Just go, before it's too late." But something in Lila resisted. The idea of abandoning the house now, after everything she'd put into it, after everything she'd discovered, she couldn't do it. She had to find a way to uncover the truth, to stop whatever was happening there. She thanked the woman and left the cafe, her head swimming with half-answers and mounting dread. As she drove back toward the house, the woods seemed to loom taller than before, their branches casting long, claw-like shadows on the road. The warning rang in her ears. Don't try to fight it. Just go. But Lila gripped the steering wheel tighter and pressed on. She had no intention of leaving. Not yet. Lila tried to ignore the old woman's warning. She convinced herself that stories like these always followed old houses, that every small town had its legends. But as dusk fell, the air in the house grew heavy, and her bravado began to falter. The whispers at the locked door were louder tonight, clearer, no longer just faint murmurs, but audible words. She couldn't understand what they were saying, but the tone was pleading, almost desperate. She avoided the upstairs hallway, forcing herself to stay in the kitchen instead. She turned on the overhead light, its harsh glow spilling across the counters, and set to making herself a simple dinner. A sandwich, some tea, anything to distract her from the building tension, but her hands were shaky as she worked. The whispers upstairs continued, punctuated by soft knocks, as if something on the other side of that door was trying to get her attention. Her resolve crumbled around midnight. The house had gone eerily silent, too silent. The kind of quiet that made you strain to hear, made you feel that every shadow in the corner of your eye was something watching, waiting. She clutched the diary tightly, as if the frail book could protect her, and decided to sleep downstairs, closer to the light. That was when she heard it, a single scrape from the kitchen floor. It was deliberate, slow, like wood dragging across wood. Lila's breath caught in her throat. Her chair creaked as she rose cautiously, her bare feet silent against the cold hardwood. She crept toward the kitchen doorway, peeking around the corner. At first, she saw nothing, but then a figure emerged from the shadow of the pantry. It wasn't human, not entirely. The thing was tall and impossibly thin, its skin the color of ash, its limbs unnaturally long. It was hunched over, its bony shoulders jutting out as it leaned against the counter. The face, it wasn't right, deep hollows where its eyes should have been. A mouth that gaped open as if it had never spoken, only moaned. It stood motionless for a moment, as though sensing something in the air. Then, slowly, it turned its head in Lila's direction. Its empty eye sockets seemed to find her. She froze, every muscle locking in place, her mind screaming at her to run, but her body refusing to move. The creature made a low, guttural sound, the kind that rattles in the throat and sends chills up the spine. Her flashlight was still on the counter. She lunged for it, her sudden movement breaking the spell of fear. The beam of light cut across the kitchen, hitting the creature's face. It let out a sound that was almost a scream, a wet, rasping cry, and melted into the shadows. Lila whipped the light around, her breath coming in short gasps, but the thing was gone. The room was empty. She collapsed onto the floor, the flashlight trembling in her hands. She tried to convince herself it wasn't real, that she was overtired, that her mind had conjured the vision. But the scratches on the floorboards were still there, fresh and unmistakable. And in the silence that followed, she thought she heard the faintest echo of the thing's rasping voice. Just one word this time, breathed softly into the still air. Lila. The next morning, Lila sat at the kitchen table with the diary spread before her. Her hands still trembled as she flipped through its pages. The image of the creature from the night before lingered in her mind, haunting her thoughts. She had no doubt now that whatever plagued this house and the woods beyond was very real. The questions had shifted. Not what is happening, but what can I do about it? In the final entries of the diary, the previous owner described a ritual he had attempted. It wasn't a detailed guide, more a frantic record of what he tried, mixed with desperate prayers that it would work. He mentioned symbols, fire, and some sort of offering. Lila studied the drawings and the jagged, scrawled instructions. The words were incomplete, the instructions broken into fragments. She wasn't sure what kind of offering the ritual required. but the entries hinted at something personal, something significant. "It's not about blood or death," one entry read. "It's about sacrifice. You have to give it something it wants, something it can take instead of you. But it's never enough. It never stops asking." Lila set down the book and stared out the window. The woods loomed tall and dark, even in the midday light. The same low tapping noise had started again, faint and rhythmic, as if the trees themselves were marking time. She needed answers, and the diary was the only guide she had. She spent the rest of the day preparing. Using the drawings as a reference, she sketched the strange symbols onto the living room floorboards with chalk. She gathered candles and set them in a circle, just as the diary instructed. The offering troubled her. The man who'd lived here before had left the details vague. He mentioned old keepsakes, things with sentimental value that the presents might accept. Lila hesitated, then went upstairs to retrieve the jewelry box she had brought with her. Inside was her grandmother's bracelet, a piece she'd cherished since childhood. Her hands shook as she placed it in the center of the circle. She whispered a soft apology to her grandmother, though she wasn't sure why. It just felt like the right thing to do. When night fell, Lila lit the candles and took her place within the circle. She held the diary open in one hand, reading the words aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. The incantations were clumsy. She didn't know if she was pronouncing them correctly, but she pressed on, repeating the phrases over and over. The air around her seemed to grow thicker, heavier. The room grew colder. As she spoke, the shadows in the corners of the room began to stretch, slithering toward her like ink poured onto a wet surface. She tried to keep her voice steady, but fear crept into her throat. The tapping from the woods had stopped, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that she could feel in her chest. The offering sat untouched in the circle's center. Lila's heart pounded as she repeated the final lines from the diary, pleading for the ritual to work. For a moment, nothing happened. The hum grew louder, almost unbearable, and the candles flickered violently. Then, all at once, the shadows surged forward. The room seemed to collapse into darkness. Lila squeezed her eyes shut, her voice breaking as she shouted the last word of the incantation. The humming stopped. The shadows receded, pulling back like a tide. When she opened her eyes, the room was silent. The candles had gone out, and the air felt lighter, almost normal. Her grandmother's bracelet was gone. She sat there in the dark, her breathing shallow. Had it worked? The creature, the whispers, the tapping, had she banished them? She wanted to believe she had, but something deep inside her whispered that it wasn't over. Not yet. Lila woke to the sound of rain hammering against the windows. The storm had rolled in during the night, and now it seemed intent on tearing the house apart. The old wood groaned under the pressure of the wind, and distant thunder rumbled through the bones of the structure. It had been hours since she performed the ritual. Despite the initial quiet that followed, she had been unable to sleep. The faint sense of wrongness still lingered, wrapping around her like a second skin. Something was still there, she could feel it. She sat at the kitchen table, clutching a lukewarm cup of tea, when the whispers began again. This time they were louder, coming not from the locked door upstairs, but from all around her. The voices were indistinct, their words a twisted murmur that sounded almost like laughter, almost like screaming. Lila froze, her tea sloshing in her mug, and then bolted to her feet. The candles from the ritual circle still sat in the living room. She hadn't touched them, hoping they might act as a protective barrier, but now their wax had run into distorted puddles. The symbols she'd drawn were smeared. In the middle of the circle, where her grandmother's bracelet had been, was something new. A small, wet handprint, black and glistening as though drawn with ink or tar. A sudden crash upstairs made her jump. She grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter and slowly made her way to the staircase. Every step creaked under her weight. The whispers grew louder as she ascended, their tones shifting from mournful wails to frantic, animalistic sounds. She reached the landing and stood before the locked door. It was shaking, not gently or rhythmically violently, as if something on the other side were pounding against it with inhuman force. The heavy padlock rattled and strained. Lila could barely breathe. She raised the flashlight and trained its beam on the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. The door stopped moving. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, with a thunderous crack, the wood split down the middle. The lock fell to the floor, and the door swung open with a long, aching groan. Lila screamed as something came through the threshold, a swirling mass of shadow and form, not quite solid, not quite smoke. The air filled with the stench of decay, and the temperature plummeted. She stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight, but managed to keep the beam trained on the thing as it moved toward her. It wasn't the creature she had seen before, not exactly. This was worse. Its shape shifted with every second, limbs stretching and retracting, a grotesque face emerging only to dissolve into blackness again. And it was angry. She could feel it raw, seething rage pouring off of it in waves. Lila stumbled into the living room, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. She grabbed the diary from the coffee table, flipping frantically through its pages, searching for anything she might have missed. The symbols, the incantations, the warnings, it was all there, but there was no next step. The man who wrote it had only described the ritual, never what to do if it failed. If this was what he'd meant by, "it's never enough," then she had no idea how to stop it. The shadow thing surged toward her. In her panic, she grabbed one of the candles from the ritual circle and hurled it at the creature. It did nothing. The thing simply flowed around it, as though mocking her attempts to fight. Its movements grew more erratic, more forceful, as it approached the diary in her hands. She realized with sudden clarity that this was what it wanted, not the offering, not the symbols, but the words themselves. The diary wasn't a guide to defeat it. It was a lure, a trap. The man before her had recorded his madness not to save himself, but to ensure that someone else would try again. The creature followed, filling the air with a terrible, bone-shaking howl. It was no longer bound by the door or the room. The storm outside raged on, and she stumbled out onto the porch, gasping for air. Lightning illuminated the woods, and for the first time she saw dozens, no hundreds, of those same shifting shadows moving among the trees. She was surrounded. She clutched the diary tightly, a wild, desperate thought forming in her mind. If the diary was the bait, maybe destroying it would break the cycle. She had no idea if it would work, but it was all she had. Without hesitation, she ran back inside, grabbed the matches from the kitchen, and set the diary ablaze. The pages curled and blackened, the ink bubbling and running down the fragile paper. The howling stopped. The creature froze, its form wavering. Lila watched, her breath caught in her throat as the shadow began to shrink. The fire consumed the diary, and the creature screamed, an ear-splitting guttural cry that echoed through the house. Its edges disintegrated, its body collapsing inward until it was nothing more than a thin wisp of smoke. The silence that followed was deafening. Lila sank to the floor, staring at the smoldering ashes. It was gone. The house felt lighter, almost peaceful. But even as she sat there, trembling and drenched in sweat, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had only traded one problem for another. The diary was gone, but the house remained, and so did the woods. She knew deep down that this wasn't the end. The presence had retreated, but it wasn't defeated. Not entirely. Not yet. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, its light creeping into the kitchen where Lila sat at the table, staring blankly at the blackened remains of the diary. Her body ached with exhaustion, her throat raw from the screams she didn't remember making. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the woods strangely calm. The air smelled fresh, as though the rain had washed away not only the dirt and grime, but the lingering sense of dread that had clung to the house. She knew better than to trust it. The previous night's events played over and over in her mind. The shadows, the screams, the way the thing from the locked room had twisted and reformed as it came for her. And then the diary, its destruction had saved her. At least she hoped it had. But as she sat in the soft morning light, she couldn't help but notice that the house still felt alive, still felt occupied. When she finally gathered the courage to return upstairs, she found the door at the end of the hallway standing wide open. Beyond it lay a small, plain room. The walls were bare, the floor covered in a thin layer of dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. In the center of the room, an old wooden chair sat under a single beam of sunlight that shone through a cracked window. It looked so ordinary, so mundane, yet Lila felt as though she were standing in a chapel, some sacred place she had no business being. She wanted to turn away, but her feet wouldn't move. After a moment, she stepped inside. The air was cold, unnaturally so. She crossed the room, her boots leaving faint impressions in the dust. As she stood before the chair, she noticed a single piece of paper resting on its seat. It hadn't been there the night before, she was certain of it. Her trembling fingers reached for the paper. When she lifted it, she found that it wasn't just paper. It was a page from the diary. The words were familiar. It was the final entry, the one she had read weeks ago when she first found the book. I can hear them coming. I'm sorry. The ink looked fresh, as though it had been written that very morning. Her pulse quickened, and she spun around, expecting to see something standing in the doorway. But the room was empty, and the house was silent. Lila crumpled the page in her fist and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. She returned to the kitchen, threw the paper into the sink, and lit it with a match. The flames consumed it instantly, leaving only ash. She watched the smoke curl upward and disappear. It should have been satisfying, but it wasn't. It felt like a hollow victory, like cutting the head off a weed while the roots burrowed deeper underground. Days passed, and though nothing overtly strange occurred, Lila couldn't shake the sense that she was still being watched. The whispers were gone. The tapping from the woods had stopped, and the locked door no longer creaked or rattled. Yet every time she turned a corner or entered a new room, she felt a presence lingering just out of sight. The house never let her forget it was still there. One evening, as the sun set behind the tree line, Lila stood on the porch and looked out over the property. The woods were still and quiet. The house was quiet. The whole world seemed to hold its breath. For the first time in weeks, she felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe the worst was behind her. Maybe the shadows would never return. Maybe she had done enough. But as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, she thought she saw something move at the edge of the woods. A shadow darted between the trees, just for a moment, so quick it could have been her imagination. She stared hard, willing herself to see nothing, to convince herself it was just the sway of a branch or a trick of the light. Then, softly, faintly, a single tap echoed from deep within the forest.